The World Ends With You, a cult classic and an anomaly for whatever system it decides to be on. This game makes for a lot of interesting talking points whenever it's brought up for a multitude of reasons. This is an action RPG developed by Square Enix in modern-day Shibuya. Well, as modern as things were in the late 2000s, the game does show its age a bit with its flip phone usage, but what can you do? You know how Square Enix tends to occasionally do those one-off JRPGs? Octopath Traveler, Chrono Trigger, Bravely Default. Actually, I guess all of those were intended to be franchises of some sorts, but you know what I mean. Well, this is one of them, and one of the more popular ones at that. The game released on the Nintendo DS in Japan in July 2007, making its way to the rest of the world in April 2008. Apparently, the game was received exceptionally well with critics, but I've gotta say, that could not be more different than what I heard about the game from word of mouth. This game got hella mixed reception from my perspective, and that was all due to its incredibly unconventional control scheme. People either loved it or hated it, and thankfully the person who recommended the game to me said that she loved it. At the time, I was a total noob when it came to JRPGs. I was still in my 2D platformer phase, you see, with the only RPG franchise I was invested in at the time being Kingdom Hearts. She said that this game was better than anything Kingdom Hearts has done, and my reaction at the time was along the lines of, I had to see for myself, not just because of that, but I was crushing on this girl at the time, so if she said jump, I would ask how high. After playing the game, my thoughts on it went from okay to pretty good to one of my favorite games of all time. Life hits you fast, kids. Seriously though, I could not get enough of this game to the point where I even bought the game's enhanced port on smartphone devices titled The World Ends With You Solo Remix, released in 2012. Unfortunately, it seemed like this game would remain a cult classic, amounting to another cast of cameo characters to be featured in the Kingdom Hearts series. And you know what? Even though I've been clamoring for a sequel in past videos, the full package of TWEWY was tightly knit, and instead of being sad it was over, I should just be glad it happened. Right? Well, turns out I couldn't have been more wrong. The cast of TWEWY hasn't shown up in the follow-up to the Kingdom Hearts game they guest starred in, even if Sora said that would happen eventually, you lying sack of shit! It was instead given yet another re-release onto the Nintendo Switch titled The World Ends With You Final Remix, and the team behind it said that if the game did well, that would determine whether or not a sequel would be considered. Huh. You know, in hindsight, I should have been a little worried about that last part, but at the time, my hype couldn't be contained. I didn't have a Switch when it was announced, but as soon as I saw the Nintendo Direct where this was revealed, I literally sold all of my Wii U games the next day, saved up my money, and bada boom, baby! I couldn't believe that one of my all-time favorites was getting the remake treatment, and the game looked so much better. The closer it got to release, though, you all know the story. Critics started slamming the game on its control scheme. Again, I should have been worried, but this was playing out exactly how things were with the original release, and my build up towards that. Everyone's saying I'm either gonna love or hate the way it plays. At this point, I just associated this sort of thing with the TWEWY brand as a whole, so I wasn't gonna let that stop me from playing. I made a review on the final remix version of the game a little after the game was released, and there I said that I didn't mind the controls at all. In fact, I went so far to say that I loved the way it played. I can be bold when I want to, dang it. But you know what's funny? After doing a follow-up video specifically on the Switch version's new content, I haven't touched this version of the game since. For the DS version anyway, I lost my DS and only found it recently, but the Switch version hasn't gone anywhere. Maybe this game's incredibly demanding controls discouraged me from giving it more time? Well, I've been meaning to give this game the revolutionary review treatment at some point, so why not just go for it? And not just the Switch version. No. We'll be discussing both the DS and Switch version in detail. Why not the smartphone version as well? I'll go over that later. But I think we've dragged out this intro long enough, don't you? This game, like I said, makes for a lot of interesting talking points when it's brought up, meaning we've got a lot to talk about. So let's go ahead and get into it all. Grab yourself a glass of water and put on a comfy pair of headphones, because it's time for the revolutionary review of The World Ends With You. Let's start with the DS version's presentational value, shall we? A DS game can only look so good, especially when blown up to fit our screens, but they did a lot with what they had. The game's made up of detailed sprite work or hand-drawn aspects so detailed and pixelated that I can't tell the difference. Either way, it looks pretty good and proportionate to how they're intended to look. Unfortunately, with so many people moving on screen at once all having such involved designs, everyone looks all jagged and rough, so the game's age does show just a bit. Of course, this was done in order to immerse the player more as they're traveling through one of the busiest areas in the world, a detail I really appreciate. It's just the shame that the hardware couldn't keep up. Environments definitely age the best as each area is distinct and sticks out from one another. I never felt as if one area blended with another. The setting of the entire game is Shibuya, and even though this one city is the only place you'll see, they wring out so much of what makes Shibuya, well, Shibuya, and as a result, I never grew tired of the city over the course of the game. This is thanks in part to the game's phenomenal art direction. The game has style and knows it, flaunting all these excellent character designs and fashion icons who will just walk by you in the background. The character designers did not need to go off as hard as they did, but you love to see it. it. If I have one visual complaint that doesn't have to do with technical performance though, I wish the game took place during different times of the day. I understand that due to the game's story, characters wake up, do their thing, then go back to sleep, but that doesn't mean they have to wake up at the same time every day, you know? Why not have some chapters take place at night or dawn? I'd love to see the city light up under a pitch black sky. That would have been dope as hell, but the whole game takes place during the day. This didn't necessarily bother me over the game, it's just something I thought of in hindsight that would have pushed the game's visuals a smidge further. The game's story is presented with character portraits and dialogue boxes. With a combined effort of great character designs, competently illustrated artwork, and a decent amount of poses per character, they do a good job expressing how everyone feels over different story beats and are charming in of themselves. From a technical standpoint, these are the best looking parts of the game, right alongside some of the attack animations. Those were dope. The game, unfortunately, features very little in the way of voice acting. There are voice clips that play over the course of different conversations, battle quotes, and full-on voice acting during the game's graphic novel-esque cutscenes, but that's about it. Not gonna lie, that's a little disappointing, but let's give the game the benefit of the doubt and say that there wasn't enough space, which very likely could have been the case for all we know. I don't need voice acting in my games, but having it teased like this kinda stings, especially when each character's voice is perfectly suited for literally every single one. Oh well, that leaves the soundtrack, I guess. Why am I acting so indifferent about it? This thing's awesome! To fit its modern day setting, the OST is full of stuff you'd flip to on a radio station. J-pop, rap, rock, and even some instrumentals that play over various scenes. This thing's got variety and quality. I absolutely adore it, and even if the DS audio output hampers them a bit, they still remain the bops they set out to be. This was one of the first video game soundtracks I bought, and I don't regret it for a second, but why are there some missing tracks and songs in this thing I don't remember? They're great, don't get me wrong, but why weren't they in the game? Lost content, boys? Well, kinda, but not really. It turns out there are some songs that never made it overseas, and on top of that, there are some new songs that were only introduced in the localized version. Why? I could understand changing some of the song's lyrics to be in English, but what's up with the ones that are MIA? This isn't really a problem or anything, just kinda weird. Oh well, the soundtrack available for purchase was based off the Japanese version of the game for those who are curious, hence why there are some songs that I didn't remember with others being missing. Overall, the DS's visuals have aged a bit, but the unique art style, setting, and bumpin' soundtrack refuse to let this game's presentational value as a whole take too big a hit. Whenever I play the DS version, how it looks and sounds is never an issue, making for one of the better looking games on a system that almost refuses to let any one game look too good. And that's impressive for damn certain. But let's be real, it doesn't hold a freaking candle to Final Remix. To say this game was cleaned up visually would be the biggest understatement since calling Tales of Vesperia a good video game. What, I already used that one? Okay, it would be the biggest understatement since calling Xenoblade Chronicles a good video game. There we go. What once was highly pixelated is now running in HD at a silky smooth 60 frames per second, and that frame rate never dipped over my playthrough. The foundation of Solo Remix's visuals were heightened to the next level, and I love it. All these characters look gorgeous, having bold outlines and a smooth hand-drawn look to them. Character portraits are brushed up to look even better, and battle animations went from looking pretty cool to pretty jaw-dropping. The color palette especially is much brighter and more vibrant, making the game pop a whole lot more. There were some UI changes to compensate for the game being on one screen instead of two, pretty much all of which taken straight from Solo Remix, which is fine. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? I see some people seeing this in a couple other aspects it takes from Solo Remix being described as lazy, but I don't know, man. It all works for the consoles, so who really cares? One thing I will call out though is the lack of full voice acting yet again. I tried to justify it on the DS, but at this point there's really no excuse. By 2018, we've seen these characters in Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance fully voicing over their lines, and it was great. I'd love to see those same voice actors flex their clear talent in this final iteration of the game, as that not only be a great selling point to this being the definitive edition, but would justify its, at the time, pretty steep $60 price tag. This was what I was hoping for the most, to be honest, and it's gotta be my biggest disappointment in terms of the presentation when it comes to this version of the game. That being said, they didn't cheap out when it came to literally anything else regarding the game's sound. Audio quality has obviously improved from the freaking DS, but the soundtrack, oh my god, the soundtrack. Like I said in a previous review, this and Xenoblade Chronicles OST are tied as my favorite in all of gaming, but for entirely different reasons. This game takes the style and unique aspects of its original DS soundtrack and takes it even further, remixing the entire thing, and it is stellar. Not only that, but it takes nearly every song released on TWEWY soundtracks not a part of the original game. Solo Remix introduced some new songs and remixes, so this game took those. Freaking Dream Drop Distance had some new bops, and Final Remix takes songs from that too. Not to mention the Japan exclusive tracks that never made it into the original. Guess what we got this time? Wish there was more than all these songs you've listened to on repeat a dozen times already? This game adds new tracks. Can I get a hell yeah? This game does allow for the option to switch to the original version's soundtrack, and having the choice is very much appreciated. But I never found a desire desire to do that, and so I didn't. I can understand that if you're used to the original version, some tracks being rearranged in specific scenes and even boss fights can be a bit weird. There's a scene pretty early in the game that's emotional as well as shocking, and the song used in the DS version was fitting. In Final Remix, oh boy. Clearly the vibe is entirely different, and in that sense, I can see a preference in how the original game used its fairly limited track list. One other instance like this that comes to mind was one of the final bosses in the game. Final Remix uses a different version of the same song, but it doesn't really fit a fight if you catch my drift. Moments like these, though, were very few and far between that doesn't detract from this game's new soundtrack enough. Plus, I feel like more scenes were improved with certain song changes anyway. For my money, it's a million times better than a soundtrack that already managed to be among my favorites. We've all got our disagreements on many aspects of the game, but nobody, and I mean nobody, this is how this game presents itself, and that's for many good reasons. All this time later, I never remembered this game looking or sounding poor in any way, and while there are some grievances I've covered, it's all superfluous. This game has some of the best presentation I've ever talked about on this review show. That being said, this is also the category with the least amount of impact on the game's quality, so why not go ahead and talk about the more important ones, starting with the story. The tale of the world ends with Yuya begins with our protagonist Neku Sakuraba. As we watch him walk through the streets of Shibuya, he yells at everyone to get out of his face and leave him the hell alone. He monologues to himself, talking about how he doesn't need anyone. They've got their business, he's got his, and that'll be that. An emo loner protagonist in their purest. Putting his headphones on, he goes about doing his thing. Whatever that thing is. My man's just vibing until suddenly he blacks out and wakes up in the middle of the main crossroads. That's weird. He also seems to have this strange pin that supposedly lets him hear people's thoughts that sorta came out of nowhere. That's even weirder. Then he gets a text message telling him to head to a popular shopping building in a short amount of time, and if he fails, he'll face erasure. Actually, that one's not that weird. I get texts of people threatening me to go to H&M all the time. But contrary to what Neku believes, this isn't spam, and he better do what the text says, as he gets a timer imprinted onto his hand counting down from 60 minutes. Congratulations, Neku, you've entered the Reaper's game! A game where people fight for their right to live by undergoing a week's worth of trials. You complete your job, you move on to see another day. Fail, and well, you already know, so let's just hope Neku doesn't find out. In order to participate though, he needs a partner. And in a short amount of time, he gets one, a girl named Shiki. And no, the captions never lie. With his partner in tow and a goal set, Neku and Shiki have to work together in order to not just survive the Reaper's game, but hope and pray that they're given another chance at life. Kind of a grim story, don't you think? These poor teenagers are thrown into this life or death game against their will, where they're forced to trust total strangers in a game of betrayal. I mean, oh my god, did I just describe Danganronpa? Despite the grim setup, the game's not all doom and gloom, far from it. There's always that looming and very real threat of death, but the game knows when to take emotional breathers and even make room for a good amount of lighthearted moments, which is appreciated. Pacing's not just well handled in terms of its tonal shifts, but also the general speed in which the story progresses. This isn't a very long game, clocking in at around 20 to 25 hours, so the story wastes little time in terms of getting things moving along and developing its characters as much as it wants to. There's rarely any fluff. Minus the middle portion of the Joshua saga, to put it that way. I felt this was the one time where the story really slowed down, but I didn't mind this too much because this time was used not only to foreshadow future events, but flesh out its cast. More on them in just a bit. Despite the game's length, it didn't feel short. The game had a goal and a clear vision on the kind of story it wanted to tell. So it did just that, and it so happened to last as long as it did, which is great. And that story it wanted to tell has a lot going for it, including a bunch of twists that really felt cheap or out of nowhere, and wonderful themes that helped make a positive impact on my personal life. The game's messages are beautiful, to be quite frank, and this game has another one of my favorite endings of all time. When discussing the narrative on its own, it's stupid close to being perfect. It knew from the start exactly what it wanted to be and excels at it. It's no wonder the game's receiving the anime treatment. The story alone is enough to justify the game's popularity. But there are a couple of nitpicks I want to address. Despite the game being fairly straightforward to follow along, there's actually quite a bit going on in the background, all of which being very interesting at that. Only problem is, you're not told all of it up front. No, if you want to understand everything that's truly going on and even receive closure on a few loose ends, you'll have to mess around in the post-game and collect all the secret reports. Now, personally, I don't mind this, because that just means more of the game for me to play and secrets to uncover, but I do feel like a good amount of the revelations you have to unlock should have been late game reveals. If anything, those who don't feel like doing doing these extra missions, we'll just look them up, but if that's the case, then the game should have just told the player these things in the main story. Again, this is just a nitpick as the story is 100% functional without these extra details, but I gotta bring it up. Other than that, while I love the cast and we'll talk about them more in detail in just a bit, I'm a little disappointed at the low amount of interactions between characters other than the protagonist. So much of this game focuses around Neku, which is great and helps him have the incredibly fleshed out arc the writers clearly wanted to give him, but the side characters are just as good, if not better, than the protagonist. So it's unfortunate that not only do they not receive nearly as much screen time, it's like they're not even allowed to have conversations with one another without Neku being a part of the discussion in some way. Some of my favorite scenes in the game involve Neku, Joshua, and Sho all being in the same vicinity. Their dynamic is actually peak fiction, but I more so mean the dynamic between these two. Honestly, I'd pay money just to have a scene with the two of them talking about whatever the hell they wanted. That'd be incredible, but the game never even lets them have one scene on their own without Neku being involved. Then there's Shiki and Rhyme's adorable chemistry, but again, we aren't given enough of an opportunity to let the girls just be girls and talk with one another. I get there's the whole impending threat of their lives at stake, but the game does give the characters some breathing room, and I wish it had used that time more efficiently to flesh out this cast that much further without adding too much to the clock. I say all this because the dialogue in this game is excellent, and I would have loved to see how the writing would have handled different dynamics. It boils down to me wanting more of a good thing, hence why it's ultimately another nit I'm picking at. Anyway, I've talked around it enough while making it painfully obvious how I feel, but I love this cast. Good God, I love this cast. In the rankings of my favorite casts of video game characters, number 1 is Vesperia, number 2 is Persona 4 Golden, and this would be number 3. It's like I shuffled around my top 3 games, almost like there's a reason they're my favorites. Huh. I've played this game a billion times in the past, and with this most recent refresher playthrough, this statement still stands. There are no bad characters in The World Ends With You. I repeat, there are no bad characters in The World Ends With You. Major, minor, I don't care who or what you are, you're great in my eyes. I'm so serious. They all have depth, complexity, and lovable personalities regardless of the game's runtime. It's ridiculous how well they were all written, again due in part to the genius dialogue. The game's writing gives everyone plenty to say with plenty of substance, in turn giving us a lot to chew on in terms of their characterization, raising the quality of its cast as a result of it all. Shiki has one of the most relatable character arcs of all time, earning her the number 1 spot in my top 10 characters I want to hug. I didn't care for Beat too much at first, but the more I got to know him and the more he opened up, he earned the number 2 spot in my top 10 characters I want to hug. Seriously though, both of these characters have a lot going on and are very flawed individuals, but refuse to let up on making me smile with everything they say. From Shiki's love for fashion and upbeat attitude, to Beat's bumbling buffoonery and heart of gold, they were the perfect characters for a guy like Neku to meet. As stated earlier, the story centers around our protagonist and his journey to becoming a better person and opening up his world, which even if you haven't played the game, I'm sure you saw a progression arc like this coming for him. We've seen the bad to Chad redemption arc a million times at this point, but he manages to be one of the better ones for many reasons. At the start, he can be irritating and even made me roll my eyes a couple of times on my first playthrough, but he's also a very realistic character and is struggling with a lot of inner turmoil. And one of those things he's struggling with ends up being, get your shot glasses ready, amnesia. Bottoms up! Like stated in a previous review though, the revelation behind this ends up justifying it pretty well, and the story beat is solved a lot quicker than you'd expect. It's like the writers knew they had the ultimate cliche and decided to write it out as soon as possible. GG. Anyway, on top of all this, the rate in which Neku changes is incredibly natural. There's no one moment where all of a sudden Neku just realizes how to be a nice person, but he slowly morphs into the exact kind of person he needs to be. Halfway through the game, you've already noticed a considerable difference in how he was at the beginning, but he's still not completely there, and the fact that such subtlety can even be conveyed through voiceless dialogue goes to show how masterful the writing in this game truly is. If that's not a good enough example to show how fantastic the characterization in this game is, then I don't know what is. Actually, yes I do, because believe it or not, Neku's not even my favorite character. No, that honor would have to belong to Mr. Steal Your Man himself, Joshua. No joke, Joshua is one of the most compelling characters I've ever seen in any form of fictional media. He's so good. He's got the best dialogue. He's got the funniest jokes. He's got the most mystery with the best payoff. He's fantastic. And as soon as I finished the game, he was my favorite, no contest. Easily one of my favorite video game characters. And the number 3 spot, the main 4 are excellent, and the side characters are arguably just as good. Rhyme is Baby, Uzuki and Karya are a riot and a fantastic duo, Sho is one of my favorite villains ever, the list just goes on and on. Everyone's got their favorites, and it's so easy to see why. Despite the general plot being nearly perfect, the characters still manage to steal the show, which is a testament to how well written they are. The story of The World Ends With You was mint. so I have no idea why they had to screw it up in Final Remix. You know how re-releases of JRPGs tend to add epilogues to their stories, wrap up some loose ends, and allow the player to spend just a little more time in this world with its characters? Well, Final Remix does this, and I was excited. The immediate other JRPG I thought of that did this handled this concept very well, that being Tales of Grace's F. Final Remix adds a new day, and being as vague as possible to avoid spoilers, it stars Neku, Bee, and this new girl named Coco. She's probably the weakest character in the game, to be honest, but she's not a bad character per se, so I guess it's all good. After all, that's the least of my issues with this epilogue from a story perspective, because it sucks! It's a couple of hours long, but barely anything happens. Most of that time is spent fighting the literal hundreds of enemies the game throws at you. What little does happen is incredibly complicated just for the sake of being complicated. The writing clearly took a massive hit, and I know in past videos I've been borderline begging for a sequel, but honestly, the original ending was perfect. I wouldn't mind if this game being its own standalone thing that accomplished everything it wanted to, making it that much better due to that fact. Well, screw that, I guess, because the new day ends with a cliffhanger. A cliffhanger! And it's a big one that's left me so unsatisfied since I played it. I was pissed, and you know what? All this time later, I just hate it even more. It's the ultimate spit to the face for what was a perfectly fine story, and now we just gotta wait for whatever the hell is coming next. Whoopee. I know that's sort of a bittersweet way to end a segment that was full of praise and gushing, but all I have to say to that is welcome to my world. Honestly, this might have been the reason why I haven't played Final Remix in so long. This crap stung. Despite that glaring issue, I don't think that it's enough to drag the story down completely. Unfortunately, I can't help but feel like it left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth even all this time later, so it does ultimately dock points for the Final Remix version of this game. But when looking back on this game's story, I don't think about this epilogue. I think of the main narrative and the journey of Neku learning to open up his world with the help of his fellow cast members along the way. I think of the beautiful themes of how being empathetic and vulnerable with other people is okay, and most of all, this game's very title of how the world ends with you. That in of itself is one of my favorite quotes ever. I care more about this than the extra content, because even though it's a cliffhanger and leading into a sequel, therefore very canon and very important knowledge, it's ultimately one bad part of an overall fantastic story full of phenomenal characters to boot. All things considered, The World Ends With You's story still remains top tier. Let's just hope we can say the same about the game's most controversial aspect, the gameplay. Listen, I know most of you want me to talk about the battle system, but because of that, I'm gonna make you all wait. Unless, you know, you just skip ahead in the video, but please don't do that, I need your watch time. No, let's first talk about everything outside of combat, because that's gonna take us a while to get through, and we just got through a beefy section. We need a breather. Starting with the DS version, you can control Neku with either the D-pad or the touchscreen as you walk through the streets of Shibuya. In Final Remix, you play with a single Joy-Con, and can either move Neku with the control stick, the touchscreen in handheld mode, or use the gyro controls while the Switch is docked, which are, well, let's just put a pin in that. It should go without saying that this isn't structured in your typical JRPG fashion. Towns, dungeons, and an overworld to be more specific. The whole game, like stated earlier, is in this one city, and the way the game's structured is by splitting the game's days into separate chapters. The entire map of Shibuya is a decent size, but you aren't given access to all of it right away. Instead, the game slowly but surely opens it all up to you by putting you in different chunks of the map. It's paced in a way that gives you new areas to keep you on your toes, while constantly revisiting familiar locations in order to allow the player to familiarize themselves with the city's layout. All of this in combination with the main campaign's reasonable length made certain that I never grew tired of traveling in the same location, even all these playthroughs later. Occasionally, however, you'll be stopped by an in-game wall. In-game like in the Reaper's game, not like in you get it. When a Reaper is in front of one of these, they'll give you a task to do in order to move forward, like fighting enemies, bringing them a specific item, so on and so forth to keep you engaged. I like how the game differentiates where you're supposed to go versus optional areas on specific chapters by having the Reapers in red be on the desired path and Reapers in black guarding optional areas while having harder circumstances to overcome. It's little touches like this that make for strong game design. The missions of the Reaper's game will consist of most of your time outside of battle, as these can range from fighting enemies to solving various NPCs' problems. Of course, you can't directly interact with everyone given that the Reaper's game takes place on a different plane of reality than the real world, therefore you've got to take some roundabout ways to help everyone out. The game takes many creative liberties to do this, such as implementing thoughts into other people's minds and acting as if you're possessing a coin to answer basic questions. Implement thoughts? What, can you read people's minds or something, Mr. Evolution? Why yes, dear child. Yes, you can. This little button at the bottom right of the screen allows you to hear what a bunch of people in the background are thinking at the time, and other than using certain characters' thoughts to figure out how to solve someone's problems in a few instances, this is just a neat little detail that I greatly appreciate. It adds a ton of charm and detail to the game, and further immerses the player in the ridiculously busy city. There are various shops to visit as well, selling items, equipment, and whatnot, and these are pretty interesting all things considered. The shopkeepers all have this friendship level sort of gauge that increases whenever you buy something, and the higher it gets, the friendlier they'll become. Why would you care about this? Well, other than nicer dialogue, dialogue, they'll raise the amount of items you can purchase and tell you about different articles of clothing's hidden abilities. Clothes are essentially your armor in this game, and on top of different stat increases, they each have a perk that you have to be told about. This allows room for customization since you won't just switch out pieces of equipment for the one with the bigger numbers. Your playstyle and what matters most to you in combat plays a role in how you build your characters. I gotta say, I love all of this. The way shopkeepers warm up to you is yet another charming feature of the game, and the different abilities incentivize experimentation and constantly switching up equipment. Not to mention, you've got to keep up with those trends, man. I'm actually serious about that, but that more so has to do with the battle system, so we'll put a pin in that as well. There isn't too much in the way of puzzle solving when traversing the overworld, but the game has enough to keep things fairly interesting. Similarly, there aren't many side quests. They're actually saved for the post-game, where you can unlock these secret reports I mentioned earlier by doing a variety of tasks. This can include performing specific actions, going to certain landmarks, defeating all the hidden pig enemies, or even fighting optional bosses that are either completely new or EX versions of various story bosses. Love it when games do this. There's also the optional New Day epilogue, but like, please don't do that. And another unlockable you get for beating the game that I'll just leave as a surprise. It's pretty amazing. But yeah, not a lot to do outside of progressing the story, and I don't think I mind this. The game's short length is packed with story beats progressing, and it's an interesting tale to follow, all things considered. There are little side conversations you can miss out on if you don't explore, and of course there are the pig noise to find, so you know, there are some other things to do. If anything, all this extra stuff to do after you finish the main campaign adds a ton of replay value. On top of different dialogue choices that slightly alter scenes, playing the game as many times as I have is yet to grow stale. But if you do still find things becoming a bit stale, there's always Tin Pin Slammer. This is an entirely separate minigame that you will play at certain story moments, but eventually you can do this on your own whenever you want. It's a fun distraction to mess around with, and on the DS can even be played with other people who own the cartridge. You control your pins with a stylus on the DS, and you can use various moves with a D-pad. Different pins have different properties in this one mode, meaning that there's a fair amount of depth to it all. I like it. In Final Remix, you control your pins the same as you would on the DS while in handheld mode, along with the gyro controls while docked. Keep in mind what I'm about to say doesn't reflect gyro controls in the battle system even a little, but when it comes to Tin Pin, screw the gyro controls. I did not like these at all. Tin Pin is a very frantic, fast-paced game, so while they're functional, they don't allow for that insane reaction time this minigame requires. If I'm playing this, it's either on the DS or in handheld mode, at least when I'm not gathering footage. That just leaves the battle system, and this was honestly what I was most worried about when it came to revisiting this game. Maybe not so much the DS version, but Final Remix for damn certain. Well, we've talked about everything else, so let's just do it. As we've been doing, we're going to start with the DS version. Battles are initiated by using your thought scanner pin and tapping enemy symbols to initiate battle. You can choose to chain multiple battles if you wish, as this increases the drop rate and can help save a bit of time if you so choose to grind at any point. This is an action RPG where you control two characters at the same time, Neku on the bottom screen and your partner on the top, meaning that yes, Neku is canonically a bottom. Your partner is controlled with either the D-pad or the face buttons to compensate for those who may be left-handed. I feel like at this point, it's no secret that Shiki isn't the only partner you'll have over the course of the game, so I'll be using footage for all three of them. They all have a similar control method where you attack by pressing the direction of an enemy, those of which called noise in this game, and keep pressing the button in this little grid that pops up, comboing your way to a finisher. Each character can wear pieces of equipment that change up how their grid looks, which only adds another layer of customization to the battle system that I appreciate. You may notice different cards at the end of every partner's grid, and these are symbols that help you build up to this game's special attacks called fusions that deal massive damage and can heal you. There are 3 tiers per character, getting more powerful and over the top the higher they are. For Shiki, you have to find which symbols are underneath the face down cards, ultimately boiling down to a guessing game. For Joshua, you'll have to pick a number that follows the given criteria at the top of the screen, either being higher, lower, or equal to the number shown. Beats is a little more complicated, requiring you to line up cards that match, and finish it all off with the skull card that'll calculate how many matches there are. It's a lot to think about, but if you can combo your matches well, you can quickly work your way up to those higher tier fusions. I used to be really good at his, but since it's been a while, I kinda suck at it now. They've all got a couple of defensive and evasive maneuvers as well. Shiki and Beat can both jump and do quick air combos if you're fast enough, and can block attacks for a second by pressing down. Their blocks are in the same vein as Sora from Kingdom Hearts though, where you don't hold the guard button down, but rather press it to guard for a second. I didn't mind this for Shiki, but Beat faces a lot of enemies that can combo him, and while you can block that first attack, they'll just string a bunch of others on you right after, which was lame. Joshua doesn't get a block, but a sidestep, which essentially boils down to the same thing, it just looks a bit smoother. He's also able to jump, but later down the road he gets a completely different aerial combo kit while also giving him the ability to fly. It's pretty freaking badass, and because of all this, he's my favorite partner to play as. Neku's an entirely different story than those three. Not only is he completely controlled with the touchscreen, but his attacks are interchangeable and the most customizable out of everyone. You can unlock and purchase pins over the course of the game that act as attacks, buffs, or even heals, all activated by a variety of different inputs, such as tapping empty space, swiping across the screen, dragging Neku, so on so on, so forth. There's a lot, trust me, but I found the inputs were, for the most part, pretty accurate. There were a couple of instances where I meant to do one attack, but another input was fairly similar, making it so that the game would register that rather than what I wanted, but those were so few and far between that I don't see this as game-breaking in the slightest. Moving also felt a bit challenging at times, since you have to drag Neku around in order to move him, which could easily be mistaken for certain attacks. But this also didn't happen too much, I just had to bring it up. Neku's got a bajillion tools at his disposal, given the impossibly high number of pins to use, all of which being capable of leveling up to increase their attack power and reload speed, with some even being able to evolve into an even higher level pin. Experimenting with plenty of different attacks proved to be a lot of fun and highly encouraged because it's time to unpin one of those earlier points, the trends. Different areas prefer specific brands, and that plays a role in the battle system as pins whose brands are at the top of the trending charts will gain a boost in power, with those on the latter end getting a decrease. This doesn't play so much of a role that what brands you use will dictate how the battles will play out, but enough so that you feel a difference. Thankfully, you can influence the trends as whatever brands you wear in battle will eventually become more popular in the area. Does that all sound pretty complicated? Maybe, but this is all happening in the background anyway, so as long as you have a good enough understanding of the basic system's combat and are keeping up with your equipment, you should still be able to come out of battles on top, meaning that this battle system honors what I believe to be the most important element, skill mattering above all else. There's clearly a lot to learn, more so than usual, since on top of all these mechanics and background elements, you also have to learn how to even play the freaking game. Thankfully, there are options that help alleviate this and allow for you to ease yourself into an admittedly overwhelming combat system. Not only are there 3 difficulty settings you unlock over the course of the game, with the 4th most challenging one being purchasable after finishing the main campaign, but you can change the settings around so that your partner is controlled by an AI, giving you the chance to focus solely on Neku as he's the most important. That's not to say that you can completely shift focus, because at some point the game will have expected you to learn how to play, as later battles become much more demanding, faster paced, and intense. Not to mention, both characters share one health bar that decreases down from their side of the screen to the other. If you want the AI to control your partner, I recommend using the settings that make it so that an AI takes over control of your partner after a few seconds standing idle. So you're still given the opportunity to control your partner character, but aren't completely punished for forgetting to play as them, since splitting your attention between 2 characters will take a while to get the hang of. But when you finally do, oh man, it's so much fun! Battles become so fast-paced and hectic, but there's a method to all this madness, as you're given plenty of options in order to come out on top. You can cancel out of your partner attacks, and all enemies have well telegraphed movements so that you're able to dodge and counter with attacks of your own. And with bosses making great use of this dual screen battle system, fights are straight up awesome to get through, especially later on in the game. But on that note, gotta be honest, not big on the final boss. It's pretty anticlimactic and doesn't take as much advantage of the whole dual screen combat system as it could have and arguably should have. Going right back to positives though, the game rewards you quite well for becoming good at all the mechanics. You can level up at a pretty decent rate, but if you so choose to lower your level in the pause menu, you can increase the drop rate and score more pins that could be money or attacks, all depending on what enemy you face and at what difficulty. And while your HP takes a massive hit if you lower your level, your other stats are mostly affected by factors outside of EXP and level ups, such as leveling up your pins and eating food, which can raise stats on their own. It's very possible to play through the entire game at level 1, which is exactly what I've done on multiple playthroughs of this game. The World Ends With You's combat has a lot of depth and a lot of quality at that. It found its niche in the form of an entirely new playstyle and works like a charm. There are some difficulties here or there, but it didn't take me long to readjust to this playstyle. Not to mention the game takes many liberties to help the player out, which is always appreciated and helps to make the game just a bit more accessible. I can understand if you just can't get into it. It's a weird playstyle and nothing else controls quite like it, but if you give it the chance and time of day, you may find yourself warming up to it and even wanting to grind. I know I did, because it was simply that fun and I wanted to spend as much time fighting as possible. Hell, on my DS copy, I reached the max level, something I rarely do in RPGs, so take that as you will. That just leaves the Switch version, which is, a little different. There are 2 methods of play here. First is solo mode, where the combat system is ripped right from Solo Remix, hence why I didn't feel it necessary to cover that version in the video. You only control Neku, having the same control method as before, using pins as his only form of attacking, healing, and whatnot. But on top of all this, his partner has been reduced to another attack. They've all got their own specific input, and the key is to attack with Neku at the same time to increase your fusion rate, which is how you reach those different fusion tiers in this game. Speaking of which, the attacks may look similar, of course only being on one screen this time, but you can actually multiply how much damage they do by playing a short minigame akin to each character's different cards in the original version, which ends up being a lot more fun than it has any right to be. It was a neat way to make it so that combat could be simplified for smartphones, but I gotta be honest, if this was the only way to play in Final Remix, that'd be lame as hell. I say this because controlling 2 characters at once made up so much of the appeal, not to mention simply porting Solo Remix's combat to Final Remix would be straight up lazy, which some people did complain about regardless, and fair enough. If you're playing in handheld mode, this is the only mode available to you, and it's straight up solo remix with a few extra bells and whistles, so I can understand the complaint. However, we've still got one extra mode to talk about, and that's co-op. In co-op, your partner is fully playable, as Neku is controlled with a single Joy-Con, so you control the other with another. Each partner is given a moveset with 3 attacks, on top of the same movement options as Neku, drag to run and really drag to dodge attacks. Although, can I ask why these are options? Partner characters take no damage, so these feel unnecessary, but I guess it doesn't matter too much. A part of me wishes that partner characters did take damage, as you can abuse their invincibility and have them dish out the bulk of damage, but I digress and should probably be thankful this isn't the case. As you all know, I don't have friends, so I played this by myself in order to replicate that feeling of controlling 2 characters at the same time, which adds a surprising amount of depth to the solo mode's combat system. Although you kinda have to go out of your way to even find out how these characters' attacks are pulled off in co-op mode. Took me until this most recent playthrough to realize that you have to go to the help option in the mode select screen. I ended up figuring them all out myself originally. Also, this seems like an oversight, but once Joshua gets his second combat style, you can't switch back and forth. You have to use the new one. In all fairness, I like it much better than his first one, but why not let me switch between the two like in the original version? This, in combination with the lack of partner characters needing to worry about taking damage, makes combat feel like it's missing that level of depth the original version had, despite the fact that I can play as 2 characters. Other than the obvious fact that there are now 2 players fighting together, there aren't any other differences between solo and co-op mode. The latter just feels like the more complete choice of the two in my eyes. Once I realized that this was an option, I felt no need to go back. I own Solo Remix, so if I really wanted to just play as Neku, I'll play that. This helps Final Remix stand out as its own thing, and generally, I find it the more fun option of the two. That being said, I have to play the game docked by picking this mode, meaning I have to use the Joy-Cons and the gyro controls that come with them. This right here, this is what kills the game for many people, and it's very easy to see why. Rather than mapping different pins to buttons, you point the Joy-Con at the screen like a pointer in order to emulate touch controls. I didn't question this when the game first came out, but in hindsight, this was an odd choice. The developers could have definitely gotten creative and figured out a way to make this combat system have more conventional controls, but a part of me feels like this was a very conscious decision. Unconventional controls, like it or not, are a part of the World Ends With You's identity, and making it so that this version were to feature basic controls would strip the game of a lot of its identity. At least, that's what I think the thought process was, and I can agree to an extent. However, I also think that giving players the option for more basic controls wouldn't have hurt. Making it so that handheld mode features direct touch controls was a step in the right direction for sure, but how about those who enjoy playing their Switch games on the big screen? Sure, the original didn't give too many other options, not like they could have given the hardware, but the Switch has a lot of controller options. Surely we could have figured something out. No use in complaining about it though, we've just got to figure out this new control method. I was worried about this because even though I defended this control method in my original review of Final Remix as a re-release, I was only playing this one game at the time, and ever since that New Day video, I haven't touched the game since because I didn't feel like rewiring my mind to compensate for a new control method all over again. But after hunkering down and deciding that this was definitely the game I wanted to cover next, I put the card on my Switch and thought, you know what? Maybe this won't be so bad. Maybe even after all this time, I'll still find myself enjoying the new control scheme. And you know what? I did. No, seriously, I really did. Despite coming back to the game after so long, I got used to the controls very quickly and even had a lot of fun. In my first playthrough of Final Remix, I did the whole thing at level 1 on hard mode, while experimenting with a bunch of different pins. This next time through, I played on ultimate, normally leveling up, doing the secret reports, optional fights, and missions to boot. Except for the ones in A New Day, I didn't want to play that one again. Watch my video on it if you want to know my thoughts on how it messed up even the gameplay, but not again, guys. Not again. What can I say though? The gyro controls are functional, and are even a lot of fun to utilize in this remix version of the original game's combat system. I won't stand here and pretend that it allows for the same level of precision as the original game's control scheme though. Tougher battles can get incredibly frustrating, especially on those higher difficulty levels, and even more so on low level runs. But those are all self-imposed challenges, and when fighting normally, they were perfectly fine and even a lot of fun in many instances. Some battles definitely translated over to a single screen better than others, but for the most part, I applaud the team for making it all work as well as it did. I'd go so far to say that some battles and bosses are straight up better than the original version, which may sound blasphemous, but it's honestly how I feel. Final Remix proved to be a lot of fun, and I ended up being glad I decided to come back to it. Hell, that's how I feel about this revisit on both ends, to be honest. It had been a while since I played this game because I found myself playing it way too much in the past. I needed a break, and man, it feels good to be back. It feels good to control two characters in this real-time combat again. It feels good to follow the story and take a peek inside this world again. This is such a special game, not just to me, but in general. There's really nothing like it, and rarely has a game ever been this good in my eyes. I tend to think out loud when playing games by myself, just muttering how I'm feeling about certain aspects and whatnot, but when playing my favorite games, all of my thoughts tend to filter into the audible phrase that is, this game is so good. And I found myself saying that while playing both versions of this over and over again. This game really is in my top 3 of all time. There's no denying that. And no matter which version of the game I'm playing, that's honestly how I feel. The World Ends With You, both the original and final remix, are phenomenal games in my eyes. They take many risks in a way that other games wouldn't dare to even attempt, and I applaud the ambition. It's generally frowned upon to force such a different control method onto the player. I can think of a few games that failed for this very reason. But what this game sets out to do works, and should that not be what matters? I'm trying to defend this game, more specifically the latter version, as much as I can, because it gets so much hate, and even after staying away from it for so long and having to learn it all over again, I just don't agree with what so many people claim. Why are gyro controls so damn frowned upon? They're a unique way of replicating touch controls for consoles, and while they aren't as precise as other control methods tend to be, I can tell you that after playing this game both normally and with self-imposed challenge, they don't need to be. The game is perfectly enjoyable and functional with this control method, and I was able to fully appreciate and enjoy both versions of the game. Along with literally every other aspect of the full package being god tier, this game is in a league of its own, and only one other title has surpassed it for me. Now, one question I know some of you are wondering is which version I would recommend and ultimately prefer. I think at the end of the day, I personally prefer the original version of the game, as that control method has more depth and accuracy than the gyro controls, but I would honestly recommend the Switch version. Why? Well, playing on handheld mode allows for the same control method as controlling Neku in the DS version, while also making your partner more of an extra attack than anything, making combat a lot less overwhelming and easier to get into. And if you find yourself enjoying the gyro controls much like myself, then you'll be able to play with two characters that way. No matter how you slice it, Final Remix gives more options for controlling the game, as well as the better visuals and larger selection of music. It's also the more accessible version of the two, being on modern hardware and even going on sale occasionally in the eShop, so if you see a good deal, give it a chance. You may not be able to get used to it all, which goes for either version of the game, and that's okay. This game isn't for everyone, but I firmly believe that everyone needs to give some version of it a shot, because while some dislike it, others love it, and you never know what side of the spectrum you'll end up on. After all, your enjoyment, much like the world itself, all end with you. So go ahead and make your choice.
The time is up.